Do you think we should start, although people?
I think they can hear you.
What?
I think they're on. They do. They've announced. I think they announced it 2-3 times.
What should we do?
They said they were going to announce it. So I think
Oh, they said they were going to announce it.
I think so. Yeah, that's what I understand.
You don't hear it here. Yeah, so we announce it here. You start now and
Okay.
announce it
You
3
announced
times.
already.
Yeah.
So we're starting 10 minutes late.
Start now anyway.
Yeah.
And we'll
So
see
can
how
I
it's
can
going.
I run on for 10 minutes?
I will let you know.
You give me a minute.
I will let you know.
Yeah.
Okay, but you start now, yeah?
Okay.
We announce it many times, but you don't hear in this room, so there is no disturbance.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can I ask you to take your seats? We're going to start now. I'm also told that the acoustics in this hall sometimes mean that when you're in the front, you don't hear well. If that's the case, however strange it seems, apparently you will hear much better if you move further back. So if you're having any problem in the front, move a bit further back. Well, welcome to this very important session, which is called Guantanamo, from Cuba to Britain. I'm very honored to have been asked by cage prisoners to be part of this session. My name is Victoria Britton. I'm a journalist. I'm also on the Council of the Institute for Race Relations and of Palestine Solidarity. And I'd just like to give a little bit of background on my involvement in these kind of issues. Partly comes from having spent more than a decade living and working in countries like Algeria, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, and South Africa, which have now become such a focus in the war on terror, so-called war on terror. But in a different way, I became involved when I met Merzem Beg's father and interviewed him for a play that I was part of, which was based on the words of Merzem's father, letters from Merzem from Guantanamo, and the words of another lot of Muslim families who were utterly bewildered by what had taken their sons, brothers, and husbands into Guantanamo Bay. Our 3 speakers will take us across the spectrum of the issues which led to what happened at Guantanamo Bay and the creation of a completely lawless world by the Bush administration. Now, you all know that President Bush, former Defense Secretary Rumsfeld, their legal advisors, John Yoo and Alberto Gonzalez, are the people who completely perverted American law and international law to create the legal black hole of Guantanamo. What you may know less well is that there are hundreds, and in fact thousands, of American lawyers who for 6 years have been fighting their own government with legal instruments to try to get a decent hearing or any hearing for the men in Guantanamo. So it's very fitting that our first speaker is one of those lawyers, and this is Zachary Katznelson, who is a senior counsel at the charity Reprieve here in London, but his background is on looking after people who had unfair death sentences in the United States, and he's worked on many issues such as prison reform and the rights of women prisoners. But for the last 4 years, as he's worked at Reprieve, he's been the representative of 40 of those prisoners in Guantanamo Bay. And so he has a very unique insight into what has gone on and into the lives of those people, and we're very privileged to have him with us today. So thank you, and over to Zachary.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. It's a difficult topic to talk about, especially on what's one of the few sunny days. I appreciate everyone coming indoors to hear this for a few minutes. And I hope that when you leave here today, you'll be inspired to do a little bit more, which is to take some action on behalf of the men who remain there in Guantanamo, men who I visited just 12 days ago. It was my 10th trip to Guantanamo Bay, and I've seen it with my eyes. I've met the men personally, and I want to tell you a little bit of their stories today, a little bit about what life is like in Guantanamo Bay. But please, as I talk, I want you to keep two things in mind. One, 6.5 years. 6.5 years, Guantanamo Bay has been open. 6.5 years, those men have sat in prison cells. 6.5 years, they have been going through what I will soon talk about. Imagine everything in your lives that has happened in the last 6.5 years. Everything that has gone by. Births, weddings, deaths, new jobs, whatever it is. And imagine that you've had none of that. You've been completely and utterly cut off from the rest of the world for those 6.5 years. That's what has happened to the men in Guantanamo Bay. 6.5 years erased from their lives in some ways, but replaced instead by true brutality. The other thing I want you to please keep in mind is that not a single person in Guantanamo, and there are 270 roughly there today, not a single person in Guantanamo Bay has had a trial. Not one. And so everyone there is accused of being a terrorist. That's why the United States has brought them there. But not one has been proven guilty. Not a single person. 6.5 years, no trials. 0 trials. So what's it like there? Who are these men? In fact, a couple of them are from the UK who remain behind. Mozambique, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, a British citizen who spent years there as well. He's now, thank God, free. But there are 2 men from London who remain in Guantanamo. Shakar Amar from Wandsworth and Binyam Mohammed from right nearby here. And they've been held for years in horrible situation, and they've had no justice. So what's a day in the life like for somebody in Guantanamo? I'll tell you what their jail cells are like. 2 meters by 3 meters, entirely made of steel. So picture living somewhere the size of your toilet for 6.5 years. The walls are steel, the floor is steel. The bunk on which you sleep is steel. Everything in there is made of steel. And there's not one single window to the outside world. It's just a steel box. Neon lights are on 24 hours a day. It's never dark. And because everything is steel there, noise echoes and echoes and echoes. So anybody walking by or any door slamming is repeated again and again and again. And there's no such thing as peace. There's no quiet in those cells. You can try and talk to this man in the cell next to you by screaming. There's a little gap under the door. You can try and scream down that gap and hope that he'll hear you. But if more than one person talks at once, that echoing starts to build, and you can't understand a word anyone is saying. So you're isolated even from your fellow prisoners. No family members are allowed to come visit. They can send letters, but it takes months and months and months for the letters to get through. And when they do, they're heavily censored. Entire pages blacked out because the Americans are afraid that someone will be sending a coded message into the prisoners of Guantanamo. Now, there's never been any evidence anyone has done that, but perhaps it's a legitimate security concern. But in many ways, it's actually worse to receive a letter from your child, from your 7 or 8-year-old son, who you left when they were just a baby, who says, "Dear Dad, And the letter will really say, I really miss you. I want you to come home so you can take me to the park, so we can play, so you can take me to school each morning. But that whole thing will be blacked out. And all it'll say is, Dear Dad, black line, black line, black line, black line. Love, Muhammad. You almost are back in touch with the world, and then that too is taken away. And so how is it that my country is doing this? How is it that my country is treating human beings like this? It's because President Bush has decided that because the men are accused of terrorism, and remember, not a single one has been proven guilty of absolutely anything. No trials in 6.5 years, 0. But the accusation is there, and the stamp of terrorism is there. And in this world today, after September 11th, that has become enough to rip somebody off the streets, to rip somebody away from their families, and to throw them into a deep, dark, legal black hole. And Bush says, well, if they're terrorists, they don't follow the rules, they don't follow the law, so why should we? And he says, look, if you criticize us, you just have to trust us. You have to trust us that we're getting it right, that we're making you safe. We say, how do you know who you have in Guantanamo when you don't have any trials? That's what a trial's for, after all. If any of us were accused of a crime by a government, you would want the opportunity, we would all want the opportunity to be able to stand up and say, you know what, you can have your say as government, but this is my side of the story. This is my truth. And let a judge decide. If I'm guilty, punish me. But if I'm not, you must set me free. And the men in Guantanamo never have that opportunity. But Bush says, don't worry, trust us, we have the right men. Now I ask, show of hands, please. How many people here believe what the government tells them, that the government is always right when they tell them something? Does anybody here believe that? Please raise your hands. Governments are made up of human beings. And for folks in the front, not a soul raised their hand, by the way. Governments are made up of human beings, right? We all make mistakes. We're all fallible. And governments that are under pressure to try and produce results for their people make even more mistakes because they're in a rush and they're desperate and they are scared of losing power. That's what happens in the United States after September 11th. America's attacked. Americans are afraid and they are angry. And they want revenge and they want action and they want to feel safe again. And so President Bush and his people, they set up Guantanamo and they set up prisons all around the world. And they round people up and they throw them inside. There have been, by the Americans' own account, 83,000 people that have passed through American prisons since September 11th accused of terrorism at some point. Today, there are more than 25,000 that remain inside. 25,000 people, for all of them too, 0 trials. Not one trial. Years and years, no trials. So President Bush is saying he's making us more safe. Now it's an interesting question to me, and I think all of you, think for a moment. September 11th, September 10th, let's say, 2001. July 2008. Which is a safer world? Which is a world where you feel more comfortable about many things? It's become a deeply unsettled place. It's become a more violent world. There has been much more death and destruction as a direct result of the policies of the Bush administration. And are we more safe? I would say no. So there's injustice against the 270 men who remain inside, the human beings who have been ripped away from their families, who aren't seeing their children grow up, who aren't able to be with their families, who aren't able to experience the world as we see it, who aren't able to feel the sunshine coming down upon you because they're in those little steel boxes with no windows at all. And then it's a tragedy for all of us because we're all now in this more dangerous world. So the question is, what can we do about it? As a lawyer, I've been fighting in the courts to try and get some type of justice for my clients. It's been a long, very slow fight. Just last month, the US Supreme Court finally, after 6.5 years, said, okay, you're not going to have a trial, but you can go to the civilian courts in the United States and see if the government has any proof. We're going to be doing that for the men. But it took 6.5 years to get to this point. Question is, how many more years will it take before we actually get a ruling in court that somebody should be set free? But you all can make a difference. Because what's gotten every single person out of Guantanamo so far, and more than 500 men have been set free so far from Guantanamo, is politics. It got Mozambique back home because Tony Blair personally said to George Bush, after being pressured by people like you, by people from all over the United Kingdom, it is not okay to hold a UK citizen in prison without charge, without trial, in brutal conditions. It's simply unjust, and we will not stand for it. You said it. Tony Blair had no choice but to listen. He made a plea to George Bush, and the evidence, the result, is sitting here with me on the stage today. Those two men who are still in Guantanamo from London, raise your voices. Join me today. Call your MP, talk to your MP, write a letter, even maybe write a letter to the man inside and let him know that you stand with him, that he's not forgotten in this world. Politics will succeed where the law has not yet. If we join together, we can make this stop. So next time I speak, maybe they'll be on the stage with me too. And it won't just be one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zachary, for that very moving vision of what it's like in the echoing chamber of Guantanamo, but also for your call to action for everybody here. Our next speaker is Gareth Pierce. She really needs no introduction here. She must be the best known, most respected, and most trusted lawyer working on the front line of so many complex cases which arise or have arisen out of the anti-terror legislation and the Islamophobia which followed September 2001. But before that, there's a whole history of triumphs in the great cases that she won in the late 80s and early 90s for the miscarriages of justice against Irish people, the Guildford Four and the Birmingham Six. The police and the judiciary and the government were shamed by what she uncovered and the release of those men, by extraordinary hard work. And there have been many, many other cases, less famous but equally difficult, that she's won. But I want to refer just to one case that she didn't win, and her own words about two young Palestinians, Sama Alami and Jawed Botme, who were wrongly convicted for the 1994 bombing of the Israeli embassy here in London. And they're both still in prison, although Jawad will come out next month. After they were convicted, Gareth spoke, and she sort of blamed herself for not having managed to get over to the jury the political context in which the case was heard. She blamed herself for not having been able to get the jury to see the political context in which these innocent people were blamed for something that they didn't do, and something which had the result of terrorizing the Palestinian community in London. All those years ago, people in the Palestinian community here remember that. And today, I think it's Gareth's ability to situate in context what is really happening in today's climate of fear among Muslims here in London and in Britain in general. Gareth.
Victoria, you're wrong to describe when men and women, Irish men and women, emerged from prison after decades. You're wrong to describe those as victories. They were defeats. They were defeats for our entire system. They were defeats under badge of shame for the lawyers who represented those people and who failed to destroy that unjust system. And what happens now today is defeat after defeat after defeat, and it's the crisis caused by these defeats and the lack of ability of the law to redress injustice that creates a terrifying abyss that we are in. The same 6.5 years that Zachary has described of life and death and defeat in Guantanamo have been 6.5 years here of the death of justice here. Now, the Americans made a mistake early on. They thought to show pictures of men humiliated, shackled, in orange suits, in cages. They thought that that would demonstrate triumph and victory. But it shocked the world. It was the visual impact of that attempted humiliation. Pictures of men on the ground in Guantanamo, pictures of men shackled like slaves in slave ships on transport planes, taking them from Afghanistan to Guantanamo. We could see it, and it shocked us. And we did what we could to do something to change it. But what's happened here has happened more silently, in a very British way. We announce legislation. We say it will go through a parliamentary democratic process. With a majority, the government that votes as sheep for legislation that destroys our basic rights. And we have done that again and again and again for 6.5 years, and we have not woken up. It's silent, it's secret. We don't see the humiliation, we don't feel it, we don't know the people. They're locked away. That's how we do it here, and that's how we succeed in destroying what we have and what we should fight for and what we should hang on to. Let's look just for a minute at what we've done and how we've done it. We interned people, small group of men. They were not meant to be representative of what we claimed was the entire threat to this country, which we said was so gigantic we had to lock the men up. They were representative. They were a symbolic gesture. But in making that symbolic gesture, to stand shoulder to shoulder with Bush, that's what Blair wanted. Stand shoulder to shoulder with Bush and his war on terror. So we locked up 12 men as a gesture, indefinitely, without trial. And in doing so, we destroyed the most fundamental right, entrenched in this country over hundreds of years, that every man and woman should be free from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. Every man and woman, if detained, should know the case against them. Every man and woman, if detained, should have a remedy in our law. We destroyed that. We locked those men up on the basis of so-called secret evidence. They didn't know it, their lawyers didn't know it, and what we deeply suspect and are sure of, became sure of, wasn't evidence at all. It was 10th-rate, low-grade, shameful material derived from the torture centers of the world. And we discovered that. Of course, of one question to witness A, an intelligence agent giving evidence briefly behind a curtain in the secret court. We asked, would you use evidence that came from torture? The answer was, yes, of course. The only question is what weight we'd give it. And our lawyers, our government lawyers, fought that issue all the way up to the House of Lords. Our government, your government, the government you pay taxes to, fought the case on your behalf that we in this country should use evidence that came from torture, and that we in this country should have secret courts to hear secret evidence to lock people up indefinitely without trial. Now, that small group of men won their case. And then the government changed the law again. Still keep secret evidence. Still use evidence not directly from torture now, but indirectly. And introduce something new, a control order. It may sound okay. It may sound, it's not Guantanamo, certainly. It's not Belmarsh prison, certainly. You're out. You're in your own home. Maybe if you're married with a family. But what about life each day for someone under a control order? How does that compare with normal life? It's indefinite. It may go on forever. You're said to be a threat to national security, but you don't know why you are. You're not told the evidence. You're not put in trial in front of a jury. Your day is circumscribed in every way. A boundary is drawn on a map. If you live in London, you can't go beyond the boundary of a few streets. You can't meet people outside the house without the permission of the Home Office. You can't have visitors to your house, nor can your wife, nor can your children, without the permission and clearance of the Home Office. Who would run that gauntlet to be a visitor? Who would? You have to telephone a monitoring company, electronic monitoring company, through the night, through the day, to show you're there at home. An American company, as it happens, whose equipment doesn't in fact recognize English accents or Arabic accents, so it constantly malfunctions. That's your life. That's the life we are giving to people who live in this country on the basis that they're a threat to national security, and we won't tell them why. And if you're particularly unlucky, and there is an extra imposition of a bank freezing order on you, you are not allowed to have any money whatsoever, ever, in your pocket. Your wife needs a license from the Treasury. She has to account every week for every penny that she's spent. On pain of not doing it, she and you will be committing an offence. And if you breach any obligation of your control order, you are subject this time, suddenly, to a criminal penalty. That means you'll be put on trial in front of a jury who will be told that you are suspected of involvement in international terrorism, whatever that means, but that no one can be told the evidence, but that you've broken an obligation. Maybe you didn't make the call in the night. Maybe someone came to your door and put their foot over the doorstep. But you will be on trial, and you can go to prison for 5 years for breaking that control order. What sort of a world have we created? What sort of a society is this part of? What have we done to our laws? What have we done to ourselves? We've destroyed legality. We've destroyed morality. We've destroyed social cohesion. We've destroyed respect for one another's faith. This only happens to one community in this country. Nobody else was interned but Muslims. Nobody else is under a control order but Muslims. Nobody else's wives and children are suffering this way but Muslim families. And it's only part of it. It's only part at every level. Our government is on the prowl for new aspects of old rights to take away. Extradition. Now, men and women can be sent anywhere in the world, but in particular to the most feared destination of all, the United States, on no evidence. Nobody has to produce it. It's a club, a gentleman's club in the war on terror in which we all combine. One of the aspects of Guantanamo shouldn't have surprised, shouldn't have shocked, perhaps. We were very naive. One of the aspects that did shock was that throughout, and still today, United Kingdom intelligence agents have been there all the time, interrogating men shackled to the floor, interrogating men humiliated, degraded, the subjects of torture. We've been there, feeding from that unlawful trough of coercion and torture and oppression. We've been there. It is little use shedding crocodile tears for what others have done. The only way that we can wake up from this nightmare, the only way is to appreciate the enormity of what's been done and not to suggest it's due process, not to suggest the law is making a difference, not to suggest lawyers are succeeding. They're not. Wherever there's a victory, the goalposts are moved. As Tony Blair said, the rules of the game have changed. And they change, and they change, and they change until we say, we will not, cannot do this to ourselves, to our children and our grandchildren. We will not do it.
Thank you very much, Gareth, for a very, very sobering look at what she's called the defeat of our system and the death of justice. Now, one of the things I could have said about Gareth before is that as a lawyer, I think she's unique in having been able to give her clients hope at the darkest moments in their lives. And several of her clients have told me that. One of them is sitting on my right. And I don't think I need to say anything really about Mozambique to this audience. But I just want to say that for somebody who's paid such an extraordinarily high personal price for his time in Bagram and Guantanamo, I think it's astonishing that he has no bitterness and has managed to turn that painful personal experience into something which is of such service to our whole community. And I think we all owe him for his tireless work on behalf of people in Guantanamo, but also on behalf of people here, just the kind of people that Gareth has been speaking about. So over to you, Muazzam.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon. There's a statement that was made earlier on about the victories and the defeats, and the saying that Malcolm X once said is that you don't take a knife and stick it in a man's back 9 inches deep, pull it back 5 inches and say, haven't we made progress? That's precisely what's happening with the cases of some of these court decisions in Guantanamo, that after 6.5 years, they have finally given people the right to have habeas corpus challenges to say, we can now actually argue whether our detention is legal or not. That's just an affront to any concept of justice, wherever you're from. The reality is that Guantanamo Bay has become the ultimate symbol of injustice, wherever you happen to look across from, whether it's the right wing of the spectrum or the left. It is untenable, and that is why many people, including Colin Powell, arguably one of the architects of the war on terror, has called for its closure. And I believe that it will probably be closed sooner rather than later. But I've always maintained to everybody who's ever asked that Guantanamo was never the worst part of this journey. It was never the worst part of the Odyssey. It was the last part of it. It was the most perhaps psychologically draining, but it was not where the torture, cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment began. And I think it's important for everybody to recognize that just like when we say the term, it's the tip of the iceberg, what does that mean? It means it's the most visible thing that you can see. It's frightening. It's something that you keep away from because you know it will harm you. But you also know that what lies beneath, that is secretive, that is invisible, that you want to stay much further away from, because that is what is much more sinister and causes much more harm. And indeed, there is a process today that's been described euphemistically as extraordinary rendition. And that's the process which has a man in his house, about to go to sleep with his children and wife in the next room, and he hears a knock on the door. And he answers that door to face a whole group of people, putting guns to his head and tying him onto the floor, throwing him in the forecourt of his own house, and in front of his wife and his children, he is shackled with his hands and his ankles behind his back, and he's given a hood that's placed over his head and carried off, never to see his family again. That is the process that takes one into places like Bagram, like the dark prison, like Kandahar, and many of the other prisons that people are extraordinarily rendered to, not just in Guantanamo Bay, but places as vast and diverse as Zambia and Gambia, as Indonesia, as Azerbaijan, as Morocco. And of course, you can see the common denominator in most of these places. They are Muslim countries. Muslim countries that have co-opted and cooperated with the United States of America, who after September the 11th said, you are either with us or against us. So they made the choice. And it is unsurprising, therefore, that countries like Pakistan are responsible for handing over more people to the United States of America that send them to Guantanamo extrajudicially than any country on this planet. And that for us as Muslims, and a great deal of you, I'm sure, originate from Pakistan, is a thing of great, great shame. One of the things President Musharraf said, and bizarrely, we have the same publisher of our books, was that we received bounties of millions of dollars for the people that we handed over without any judicial process. And the reason why? Because life was cheap. People were valued very little. All of this war began in the name of Operation Enduring Freedom after September the 11th, which was a terrible attack, which most people, Muslim or otherwise, don't agree with. But at least we know to the single digit how many people died that fateful day. 2,976 people. We have no idea of the numbers of people that have been killed in Iraq or Afghanistan, and nobody even cares to count. And the reason is because they don't count. Not the dead and not the ones who killed them. And then if you transfer that onto something that is a nasty byproduct of a war which allows the deaths of millions of people in Iraq and Afghanistan, i.e. the detention of people without charge or trial, then it is relatively easy to do if you can kill people en masse than what is detaining them en masse in comparison. In the Bagram detention facility where I was held for almost a year, many things took place that included some of the worst torture, because even according to the United States definition, or Alberto Gonzalez's definition of torture, where he says that for something to be torture, it has to include organ failure or death, otherwise it's not torture. In Bagram, death occurred. People were beaten to death by American soldiers. And not because they had committed a crime, other than the crime of being Muslim in their own country, but simply because people wanted to experiment with how far they could take something. And there's a film called Taxi to the Dark Side, which I urge all of you to see. It won the Oscar for the best documentary 3 months ago. And that is quite amazing, considering that happened in America, in Hollywood. And this film features interviews with myself and other people who witnessed these deaths, including the American soldiers who carried out the killings. And part of that process included a man being brought to the front of the cell where I was held in, with his hands tied above his head like so, suspended, and a hood placed over it. And there he was punched and kicked and dragged until he was unconscious and taken to a secret cell even smaller than that. And he remained in this position. But that night, they administered to him what's known as the Peroneal Strike, a Thai boxing style kick to the top of the thigh that was delivered that night over 200 times to this man's leg. And the reason? Not because they were interrogating him, not because they were asking him any questions. They knew he was a simple taxi driver by this time. He was exonerated of any wrongdoing, but only after he died. The reason was because every time he was struck, he said one word twice: Allah, Allah. And because the passing soldiers thought it quite amusing that this young Afghani man says Allah, Allah every time we hit him, let's see how many times he'll say it. And let's see how many people can get him to say it. And by the time he was dead, the autopsy report that was produced by the American military said that had he survived, his leg would have required amputation, and that it looked like it had been run over by a truck. And these were human beings that struck these blows, not a truck. But another thing took place in Guantanamo Bay, and that was Detainee 650. Detainee 650 was not a man detained in Guantanamo or Bagram. It was a woman, a Muslim sister, who had been detained and held for the periods of 2002 up until late 2003. Her identity has yet to be established, but it has been confirmed by independent sources, which are not all detainees, that this person existed. But the manner in which she was treated is truly horrific and shocking. When I was interrogated in Bagram, and I was shown pictures of my wife and children that they had received from my house, letters also that had been intercepted, that you can see upstairs in the gallery when you get a chance to go and visit the artworks made by the prisoners in this country. You can see some of those letters that I wrote and were written to me at that time. But one of the things they did, that during that period they said, do you think we left your wife and children safe? Do you think they're okay? Do you think we would have left them alone? And waving the picture in front of me, the sound of a woman screaming next door. Now, I didn't have to be a genius to figure out what it is they're trying to infer from this is happening next door. Alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I later found out and discovered that it wasn't my wife. It was somebody else's wife that was being tortured next door. And that was confirmed by some detainees who escaped from Bagram in 2005, and they did an interview and spoke about how they saw this woman, a Pakistani woman, who had been removed from her family in Pakistan and her children, and that she had lost her mental faculties, and that she'd been treated in the same way as the men had, and the men in protest went on hunger strike, something that continues to this day in Guantanamo for different reasons, but people who are detained nevertheless carry out these hunger strikes. And they hunger struck until she was no longer kept in that place. She is one of the many people that have disappeared, not the ones that made it to Guantanamo, not the ones who have people like Zachary and Clive Stafford Smith representing them, fighting their cases in the court of public opinion because the court of law simply doesn't apply to them. In a land where the iguana, which is a reptile and a lizard, is protected by the Endangered Species Act, these men have to fight for their clients under no sets of rules or laws or regulations, because the enemy combatant, the enemy alien, is a non-person who has no right to any legal succor. They are less than human beings. And that is what all of us who were detained in Bagram before we ever made it to Guantanamo had to be designated as. Once we were first taken into US custody, it was said of us, or it was said to us, you are now the property of the United States of America, and you have no rights. Of course, by this they mean you have no human rights, because you are less than human. Now, it's easy for us to blame the average soldier and say, look, they're all horrible, they're all haters of Muslims, and they're all Lindy Englands and people who carry out these massacres and abuses like they did in Abu Ghraib and elsewhere. But there has been an atmosphere that's been created that let this happen. And those people who've created this atmosphere are right at the top, because the orders, when they fall, they don't go up. Gravity doesn't travel that way. The penny, when it drops right down to the bottom, to the average soldier, who interprets through their standard operating procedures, what is it that my defense secretary meant when he scrawled on a note, I stand for 8 to 10 hours a day. Why is standing for them, meaning the detainees, limited to 4 hours? When the defense secretary makes this statement, he knows that when he stands at his leisure. But he knows that when we stand with our hands tied above our heads, chained to a ceiling with a hood placed upon it, getting beaten and struck on our ribs or our legs at any given point. And when the soldier interprets this, he interprets the statements of people like President Bush, who've said in the way that only Bush can say, I don't know what these men have done, but I know they're bad men. Or that these are the worst of the worst. They are terrorists and they are murderers, and they are so dangerous that on the flights that we transport them from country to country while we're extraordinarily rendering them, we have to muzzle their mouths lest they bite through the cables of the aircraft in order to bring it down, because these people are deranged psychotic maniacs. That's how they've described myself and hundreds of people. The great paradox, of course, of this is that 500 plus people have been released from Guantanamo Bay. But none of them, as Zachary said, through any legal or judicial process. It was because of the political processes. It was because of embarrassing situations created where even ministers and politicians in the United States of America and elsewhere started saying, this is bad for our reputation. This is bad public relations. Therefore, we have to close this place down, or we have to start sending people back. But then what we can do in future is never let people know openly how we detain people again. And that's why the secret detentions process is so important for people like you, brothers and sisters and friends, to understand that the people who have been detained in this manner, that have been picked up literally from their streets, in their houses around the world, were ordinary people. And they have been abandoned because people think they are safe. And that's why, sadly for me as a Muslim, I find it very difficult getting the Muslim community to act and react in the way that is incumbent upon them. One of the things I want to tell you, just to finish off, just to tell you that the detainees there, though may have been forgotten, they have not forgotten their Lord, and they have not forgotten what they are supposed to be here for. My first prayer in US custody is something I never forget. I will never ever forget it. We were taken onto a C-130 transport plane and seated with a hood over our heads and our hands tied behind our back. Our legs were shackled across the floor and a strap was put right across our legs. And there was about 5 or 6 of us, I think, although I don't know because I couldn't see. But what I could see through the cloth was the flashes that were taking place, the camera flashes, because we knew from this point and further on that they liked taking trophy pictures. I could hear over the din and the roar of the engines a Libyan man next to me in the same position, seated on the floor of this aircraft with the screaming soldiers and the screaming engines. And he said in Arabic, "Akhi dakhala waqt as-salah la budda an nusalli." The time for prayer has come. We must pray. And I said, "You're on my left, so you must be the Imam." And we began, and he began his prayer, Allahu Akbar. At this point, an American soldier came along. He put a knife close to me, and he said, "Listen, you," and he swore, "If I hear you speak again, I'll slit your throat." But we continued to pray, and my throat was intact. So people, sometimes they ask me, "Brother, did they ever allow you to pray? Did the Americans let you pray?" And my answer is, my friend, there is no instance in which they could ever stop me from praying. And in this way, if that is the case, I will add to that, there is no instance in which they can stop me from trying to campaign for the brothers that remain there. And if that's the case with me, then I ask that to be the case with you. Jazakallah khair.
Thank you very much indeed, Merzam. And I'm glad you ended on that note of what you can all do. Because Merzam mentioned the amazing exhibition of art made by people from Belmarsh and Long Lartin. And if you haven't already looked at it, it's in that corner of the gallery, and I urge you to go and have a look at it. And in the course of the afternoon, you'll be able to also talk to 2 other men who were previously held in Guantanamo, Ruel Ahmed and Shafiq Rasool. They'll be either up there or they'll be at the cage prisoners stall. And the number of that is G71. And at 2 o'clock, Merzam will be signing copies of his book for you. But at the same time, I also want to urge you to visit another stall, which is D138, and that is Hugs. For those of you who can see from here, if you look at this website for Hugs, you can see the work being done by volunteers, and they're mostly young women with large families and no time at all, who are doing an amazing work of supporting prisoners of all sorts, both in Guantanamo and here. And you'll know when you're getting to the Hug stall, because not only does it have lots of white balloons above it, it has lots of children. And yesterday and today, those children have made literally dozens of cards for prisoners. And this is the kind of very simple campaigning that all of you and all of your families could get involved in. And I want to just end by reading some words written by those forgotten detainees. These words were written on the 26th of February 2004, and they remain as relevant now as they were then, although some of the men are no longer in prison, but they're under control orders which are just as vicious and destructive of their lives. These are their words. We were arrested in December 2001 and taken straight to Belmarsh prison. We know that the police in this country have enormous powers to investigate suspected terrorists. Why did no one ever speak to us? Why were we never asked a single question before being locked up as terrorists? We have never had a trial. We were found guilty without one. We are imprisoned indefinitely and probably forever. We have no idea why. We have not been told what the evidence is against us. We are here. Speak to us. Listen to us. Tell us what you think and why. If you did, you would no longer believe we were a threat to this country. You would think perhaps that there's not the emergency you've imagined here. Everyone gives their opinion about us. Why not think of coming to us first, rather than locking us up and never speaking to us? Signed, the Forgotten Detainees. Thank you very much, and thank you to all our speakers.